A medieval chronicler once described a knight who stood taller than two men. Across Britain for centuries, stories have whispered of giant knights, warriors of impossible size clad in mountains of steel. These legends speak of guardians who defended sacred hills and fought in forgotten wars, their footprints left in folklore from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands. But what if these tales were more than just fireside fantasy? Today, we begin a historical detective story, piecing together clues from dusty manuscripts, oversized artifacts, and ancient bones. By the end, you will possess a clear understanding of how one of England's most enduring myths was born and why it still captivates us. We will ask if a rare medical condition could explain these titans and examine why kings might have wanted their people to believe in such protectors. What is it about a giant in armor that speaks so deeply to our longing for heroes? These colossal figures are not the wild, club-wielding giants of other tales. They are something far more specific and, in many ways, more haunting. They are the giant knights of Albion. Picture, if you will, a warrior standing 7 or even 8 feet tall, a height that would have been utterly staggering in the medieval world. He is not a ragged monster, but a figure of terrifying order, encased in plate armor so vast that no ordinary man could even lift a single greave. His strength is legendary, able to uproot small trees to use as clubs or hurl boulders that would serve as siege weapons. Yet his role is almost always one of solemn duty. He is a guardian, a silent sentinel. In countless stories, these knights are found not rampaging through villages, but standing watch over ancient barrows, lonely hill forts, or sacred springs. They are the eternal defenders of places the old world considered holy. Some tales cast them as cursed beings, doomed to patrol their posts until a brave soul breaks the enchantment, often with an act of purity or courage rather than brute force. This chivalric element is crucial. They are knights, bound by a code, even in their monstrous size. This connects them directly to the world of King Arthur and the romantic ideal of Albion, that mystical name for a Britain of lost virtue and grandeur. We hear echoes of them in local legends across the country, figures like the giant of Cerne Abbas, associated with the ancient hill figure, or the spectral knight of the gargantuan lance said to ride on certain moonlit nights. They are the mythic border guards between the human realm and the older, wilder magic of the land itself. But why would such a precise and persistent legend take root? What real-world seeds could have grown into stories of armored titans? To understand these armored guardians, we must first travel back to a time long before castles and crusades, to the very dawn of Britain's stories. The land itself was said to be built by giants. In the oldest Celtic myths, the hills were their graves, the rivers their tears, and the standing stones their discarded tools or petrified forms. Figures like Gog and Magog, woven into London's own foundation legend, were not just big people, they were primordial forces, the literal bedrock of the island. These beings explained the unexplainable, giving a face and a story to the dramatic, rugged landscape that early peoples inhabited. A massive, oddly shaped hill wasn't just a geological formation, it was a sleeping giant. A circle of vast stones wasn't just a temple, it was a gathering of titans. This is the deep cultural bedrock. When the Romans came, and later Christianity, these old gods and giants couldn't simply be erased. Instead, they were often recast. The mighty earth shapers became demons, or foolish brutes defeated by saints, or, in a more fascinating twist, they were given a kind of honorable retirement. This is where we see the seeds of our giant knight. A pagan guardian spirit of a sacred spring might, over generations of storytelling, slowly put on the armor of the new faith's protectors. He becomes less a wild god of the hill and more a Christian soldier standing watch over it. This transformation is a powerful metaphor for the medieval mind itself. The idea of a wild, chaotic landscape being tamed by chivalric order and divine law. The giant knight embodies that very transition, a force of the old world now bound by the codes and duties of the new. We see this continuity etched into the land. The famous Cerne Abbas giant, an ancient hill figure, is one likely candidate. While his origins are probably pagan, medieval folklore often came to describe him as a giant slain by a hero, or even as a knight who fell in battle. Similarly, many a lonely barrow or imposing stone circle in the British countryside later gathered tales of a spectral, oversized knight who guards its secrets. The story evolved, but the location, the sense of a powerful presence tied to a specific place, remained stubbornly the same. The giant never truly left. He simply changed his clothes, trading the skins of a wild god for the plate armor of a sentinel. So the next time you hear a local tale about a giant knight near an old earthwork, you're likely hearing the latest chapter in a story that is thousands of years old, a whisper from a time when the land itself was alive with titans. But the land only whispers while parchment shouts. To hear the giant knight speak, we must turn to the medieval chroniclers, the men who sat in candlelit scriptoriums and tried to pin the swirling mists of legend onto the page. One name towers above the rest: Geoffrey of Monmouth. In his History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 12th century, Geoffrey didn't just mention giants. He built his national origin story upon them. He tells us that the island of Britain was originally called Albion, and it was inhabited only by a race of giants. When the Trojan hero Brutus arrived, he and his men had to fight and clear these titans to claim the land. This was a profound act of myth-making. By placing giants at the very foundation, Geoffrey gave Britain a heroic, epic past to rival the tales of Rome and Troy. He wasn't just writing history, he was forging a national identity. And within this grand saga, we find specific, chilling portraits. One of the last giants Brutus's men face is named Gogmagog, a creature of immense savagery and strength. The description is not of a mindless beast, but of a formidable, almost noble adversary. He is a warrior, the last defender of his people's homeland. In this, we see the prototype of our guardian knight, a colossal figure defending what is his against a new, ordained order. Geoffrey's work was wildly popular, copied and expanded for centuries. Later, monastic writers, adding their own local flourishes, often included tales of giant knights. A chronicle from the borders of Wales might speak of a spectral, oversized knight seen near an old Roman fort, a clear blending of Geoffrey's foundational myth with local ghost stories and physical ruins. But we must ask, what were these writers really doing? Were they recording honest folklore, or were they inventing something useful? The answer is likely both. For a medieval chronicler, a story didn't need to be factually true in our modern sense to be real. It needed to convey a deeper truth about power, morality, or divine will. A story about a giant knight defeated by an ancestor of the current king served a powerful purpose. It legitimized that ruler's right to the land. It said, "My forefather didn't just take this territory, he heroically won it from a monstrous, pre-human force. He brought order from chaos." This was potent propaganda, woven into the very fabric of history. Furthermore, these tales often served to explain the unexplainable physical world. When plowmen turned up massive, fossilized bones, or when villagers gazed upon the crumbling cyclopean walls of a prehistoric hill fort, they needed an explanation. The chronicler provided one. Those aren't old animal bones, they are the remains of a giant. Those aren't ancient fortifications built by forgotten humans, they are the castle of a giant knight. The written word gave authority to the local rumor, fossilizing the folklore and passing it down to us. So when we read these vivid passages of giants clashing with heroes, we are not looking at a newspaper report. We are reading a complex document of pride, faith, and political necessity, one that dressed the ancient bones of the land in the splendid armor of a story. Geoffrey of Monmouth's giants laid a foundation, but it was the Arthurian legends that gave them a suit of shining, if sometimes sinister, armor. The world of King Arthur is filled with figures who blur the line between man and monster, courtly knight and force of nature, and it is here that our giant knight finds his most famous literary home. Consider the Green Knight from the 14th century tale Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is a colossus, described as a half-giant, towering over the knights of Camelot, his beard like a bush, his grip capable of holding his own severed head. He is the ultimate challenger, a being from the wild, untamed forests who rides directly into Arthur's court to test its famed chivalry. He is not a mindless ogre. He is a sophisticated, moral enforcer, a wild knight who actually upholds the very ideals of truth and courage that Camelot professes. He exists outside the court, yet understands its codes better than many within it. This is the archetype perfected, the giant as a moral mirror, reflecting the strengths and flaws of human society back at itself. Other romances feature similar figures, knights of impossible size and strength who guard bridges, challenge travelers, or dwell in remote castles. They are often adversaries, but their defeat is never a simple act of slaughter. It is a rite of passage. To overcome a giant knight is to prove one's worth, to graduate from mere strength to true virtue. In this way, the giant knight serves a crucial narrative function. He is the obstacle that forges the hero. But were they ever allies to Arthur? The legends are more ambiguous here. Some stories speak of Arthur himself employing giants in his wars, mighty beings whose loyalty was to the crown rather than to any code of chivalry. This paints them as tools of royal power, relics of a wilder age pressed into service for a new order, much like the landscape itself was being tamed. More fascinating is the concept of the natural knight, the wild man who, like the Green Knight, embodies the raw, untamed virtues that the polished court has perhaps forgotten: bravery, honesty, a direct connection to the land. These figures are not civilized, yet they are often more honorable than the scheming lords within castle walls. They represent a deep medieval anxiety and fascination, the idea that true virtue might not come from courtly manners and fine silks, but from the ancient, stony heart of Albion itself. By weaving these colossal beings into the Arthurian tapestry, storytellers did something profound. They connected the oldest myths of the land, the giants who built the hills, to the newest national hero, the king who would unite them. The giant knight became a bridge between a pagan, primordial past and a Christian, chivalric future. He was a reminder that the wildness was never fully conquered, only waiting at the edge of the forest, or standing guard over a forgotten tomb, ready to test the next generation who claimed the name of knight. This literary evolution gave the myth a permanent home in the British imagination, but it also points us toward a tangible, physical mystery. If these stories were inspired by something real, what evidence did people actually hold in their hands? The legends paint a vivid picture of movement, of these titans striding across moors and swinging colossal swords. Yet the cold reality of steel and physics presents a formidable challenge. To understand if a giant knight could even function, we must first grasp the reality of the armor he is said to have worn. A full suit of plate armor from the late medieval period, the kind worn by a man-at-arms, was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was not the cumbersome iron coffin of popular belief. A complete harness typically weighed between 45 and 55 pounds. Crucially, that weight was distributed across the entire body by a system of straps and points, making it far more manageable than carrying a single heavy backpack. Modern historians and armorers, through meticulous reconstruction and testing, have shown that a fit, trained knight in a well-fitted suit was surprisingly agile. He could mount his horse without a crane, perform rolls and cartwheels, and even climb ladders. The design prioritized mobility, with articulated joints at the knees elbows and shoulders, allowing for a full range of motion. The real limitation wasn't weight, but stamina and heat, as the interior became a sweltering, exhausting microclimate during sustained exertion. This is the baseline for a normal-sized warrior. Now, scale that up. Imagine a man standing 7.5 feet tall. To armor him proportionally, every single plate, every articulated lance, every component would need to be significantly larger, thicker, and heavier to maintain structural integrity. The weight would not increase linearly, it would multiply exponentially. A suit for such a giant could easily surpass 150 pounds of concentrated steel. The engineering challenges become immense. The leverage on those scaled-up joints would be tremendous, making them points of catastrophic failure. The metal itself, hammered by hand, would struggle to maintain uniform strength across such large surfaces without becoming impractically thick. A modern armorer, when presented with this hypothetical, would likely point out that the metallurgy of the time simply couldn't produce a functional, mobile suit of that scale. It would be less a suit of armor and more a stationary iron shell. This casts serious doubt on the literal image of a giant knight maneuvering in battle. So where did this persistent idea come from? Look to the historical record, where exceptional men were transformed by the stories that grew around them. Take John of Gaunt, the powerful son of King Edward III. He was noted for his impressive height and commanding presence, a true giant among the nobility of his day. In an age where the average man stood several inches shorter than today, a figure like Gaunt would have been visually staggering, especially when clad in full regalia on a massive war horse. It takes only a generation or two of storytelling for a very tall, powerful knight to become, in memory, a literal giant. His actual armor, preserved and perhaps displayed, would have seemed impossibly large to later peasants or even monks copying chronicles who had never seen a man of that stature. Every historical account we have of unusually large warriors, from the bodyguards of Byzantine emperors to the champions of Scandinavian kings, follows this pattern. The reality of a big man is filtered through awe, exaggeration, and the human need for the superlative. His custom-made armor, already larger than standard, becomes in the telling a relic of a mythical giant. The visual comparison is stark. Place a normal suit of 15th century Gothic plate next to a hypothetical scaled-up version. The difference isn't just one of size, it's one of fundamental purpose. One is a tool for a living warrior, the other is a sculptural monument. This enigma of the armor forces us to a crossroads in our investigation. If the literal existence of a functioning giant knight in plate armor is a physical improbability, then the myth must be serving a different, deeper purpose. It points us away from the battlefield and toward the crypt, toward the silent evidence buried in the earth that first sparked these towering tales. The silent earth, however, holds its own testimony. Scattered across Britain and Europe are physical objects of such imposing scale that they seem to demand a giant's hand to wield them. Walk through the arms and armor hall of any major museum, and you will eventually stop before a case that gives you pause. There, resting on its stand, is a sword of impossible dimensions. Take, for example, the magnificent two-handed swords from the 16th century, like those in London's Wallace collection. These weapons, often over 5 or even 6 feet in length from pommel to point, were not fantasy props. They were real historical artifacts, sometimes called bearing swords or processional swords. Their purpose was ceremonial, carried before magistrates or in civic parades as symbols of authority, not to be swung in the heat of battle. The sheer spectacle of such a blade, gleaming in the sunlight during a town festival, was undeniable. To a peasant in the crowd, or to a later generation hearing the story, the logical conclusion was simple. Only a giant could fight with that. The same misinterpretation applies to those astonishing suits of armor that seem built for a titan, like the famous garniture of Henry VIII, now in the Tower of London. The king's armor, especially later in his life, is shockingly wide and imposing, a testament to the monarch's girth and his desire to present an image of irresistible, colossal power. To an observer without context, this wasn't the armor of a portly king, it was the armor of a giant. These objects, divorced from their original ceremony and pageantry, became the physical anchors for the legend. They were the proof people could point to and say, "See, it must have been true." But the most potent evidence came from under the ground. Across the British countryside, you can find places marked on old maps as the giant's grave or the giant's tomb. One famous example is the giant's grave in Pentrefellin, Wales, a long, grassy mound bordered by stones. Another lies in the parish of St. Breoch in Cornwall, a massive stone coffin over 10 feet long. When such a coffin was unearthed in earlier centuries, perhaps during ploughing or construction, the discovery would ripple through the local community. The logic of our ancestors was direct and visceral. A long grave must have held a long body. What they were likely encountering, however, was a knight's burial. A medieval coffin was often designed to accommodate the deceased not just in repose, but with the full honors of his station. This meant space for a great helm to be placed at his head, and sometimes for his feet to rest upon a lion or other heraldic beast. The coffin wasn't a body cast, it was a ceremonial container. The result was a hollowed-out stone space that could be several feet longer than the occupant. To villagers digging it up centuries later, finding only dust and perhaps a few fragments of rusted mail, the conclusion was inescapable. They had found the resting place of one of the giant knights from the old stories. The grave itself became a shrine to the legend, its very dimensions serving as the ultimate witness. This process of misinterpretation is not a sign of ignorance, but a window into a different way of seeing the world. Before modern archaeology, there was no concept of cultural context or ceremonial purpose for objects. A sword was for fighting. A coffin was shaped to its occupant. Therefore, an oversized sword meant an oversized warrior. An elongated stone box meant an elongated body. These artifacts were not lies, they were puzzles that people solved with the only framework they had, the framework of story and myth. Each unearthed great sword, each massive empty sarcophagus, was another seed planted in the fertile soil of folklore. They transformed local speculation into confirmed fact, giving the giant knights a tangible history written not on parchment, but in steel and stone. Yet this tangible evidence points toward a more human and perhaps more poignant origin. If these graves and swords speak of exceptional size, but not supernatural giants, what could explain the rare individuals who inspired such awe? The answer may lie not in legend, but in biology. Cornwall's rugged coast provides one of the most dramatic settings for these legends. St. Michael's Mount, a tidal island crowned by a medieval monastery and later a castle, has a guardian known simply as the Giant. Local lore says this colossal being once lived on the mount, terrorizing the mainland. In one version, a brave boy named Jack climbed the island, dug a deep pit, and lured the giant to fall in. In another, the giant was a more solitary figure, building the island's causeway with his own hands, a creator as much as a threat. The story perfectly marries the imposing geography with the archetype, the island itself becoming the giant's home and throne, its isolation making the tale feel plausible. Travel north to the misty shores of Scotland, and the giant knight takes on a spectral form. Dunstaffnage Castle, an ancient stronghold of the Lords of the Isles, is said to be haunted by a ghostly guardian of immense size. This silent figure, clad in shadowy armor, is seen walking the battlements, a protector tied not to a pagan past, but to the very stones of the fortress. He is a sentinel of history itself, a reminder that some loyalties outlast death. The legend serves to deepen the castle's aura of ancient power, suggesting its safety is guaranteed by forces beyond the living. In the heart of England, Shropshire's distinctive Wrekin Hill, an isolated volcanic outcrop visible for miles, is the domain of another giant. The tale here is one of creation and spite. A Welsh giant, carrying a spadeful of earth to dump into the River Severn and flood English towns, was tricked by a cobbler. The cobbler, meeting the giant on the road, showed him a sack full of worn-out shoes, claiming he had walked so far from England that he had worn them all out. Believing the land was vast and not worth the effort, the giant dropped his load, which became the Wrekin. While this giant is less a knight, the story's attachment to a specific, unmistakable landmark shows how these figures explain the shape of the world. Finally, in Dorset, the most famous and enigmatic figure of all is carved into the chalk hillside, the Cerne Abbas giant. This ancient outline of a naked man holding a massive club is a prehistoric mystery. Over centuries, however, local folklore worked to assimilate him into the more familiar knightly narrative. Some tales claimed he was a real giant slain by the villagers, his outline etched to mark his fall. Others, more creatively, reinterpreted the club as a fallen knight's lance and saw the figure as a memorial to a slain hero of immense stature, sleeping in the hill. This reinterpretation is a powerful example of the myth's pull, the human need to dress the strange and primal in the recognizable armor of story. From the tidal island to the haunted castle, from the lone hill to the chalk carving, the pattern is unmistakable. The giant knight is not a single story, but a flexible template, a way for communities to explain, claim, and animate their most striking landscapes. Every strange hill needed a builder, every lonely fortress a guardian, every ancient carving a history. The giant knight provided the perfect, towering protagonist for these local dramas, his footprint pressed into the soil of the entire nation. Beneath the armor and the ancient graves lies a deeper, more human truth. These stories of giant knights were not merely explanations for odd artifacts. They were vital psychological tools. In a world shadowed by very real terrors, from Viking raiders appearing on the horizon to the upheaval of the Norman conquest, the idea of a superhuman defender offered a profound comfort. Imagine a peasant family huddled in their hut, hearing rumors of approaching armies. The knowledge that a colossal, armored spirit was said to guard the old hill fort on the ridge, or that the king himself descended from heroes who slew giants, provided a layer of psychological resilience. It transformed passive fear into a shared narrative of protection. This taps into a universal archetype, the guardian giant. Across cultures, we see this figure emerge, from the golems of Jewish folklore, clay giants created to protect communities from persecution, to the colossal statues of temple guardians in Asia, whose imposing presence wards off evil spirits. The giant knight is Britain's specific expression of this deep-seated need, a figure of immense power dedicated not to destruction, but to safeguarding the vulnerable. Folklore scholars point out that such myths serve a dual purpose. First, they explain origins in a way that reinforces identity. Saying your land was won from giants by a heroic ancestor is far more potent than saying it was taken from another tribe just like you. It creates a foundational story of righteous struggle, legitimizing a people's claim to their home. Second, they externalize fear. By giving a face and a form to the dangers of invasion, chaos, and the unknown wilds, a community can confront it symbolically. A giant knight guarding a border is a story you can tell your children, a mental bulwark against the darkness. The myth provided a sense of order in a disordered world, assuring people that even if their human lords failed, the land itself, through its ancient titan, would rise to defend them. This psychological scaffolding made the legend incredibly durable, allowing it to survive centuries of social change. But this leads us to a fascinating and very modern question. If these stories were born from a need to explain the world, what happens when science begins to provide its own, very different answers? The need for a towering protector was so powerful that it eventually became woven into the very fabric of identity, stamped onto seals and banners for all to see. This is where the myth of the giant knight steps out of the storybook and into the official record through the coded language of heraldry. In the medieval world, a coat of arms was more than just a pretty picture. It was a legal declaration of who you were, where you came from, and what you stood for. To place a giant on your shield was to make a bold, deliberate statement. Consider the Darcy family, powerful barons in medieval England. Their coat of arms famously featured not one, but 3 giant heads. These were not friendly faces, they were wild, bearded visages, often shown with necks writhing like serpents. The message was clear and brutal. Our ancestors conquered these primal forces. By displaying the heads of giants, a family like the Darcys were proclaiming their foundational role in bringing order to a wild land, transforming their lineage from mere landowners into civilizing heroes. It was a claim to ancient authority, rooted not in recent battles, but in mythic foundational struggles. This symbolic triumph over chaos was a potent political tool, especially for families whose actual historical origins might have been more modest or murky. The giant on the shield served as a permanent visual argument for their right to rule their estates. The most famous civic example takes us to the heart of the nation itself, the city of London. For centuries, the great ceremonial processions of the Lord Mayor's Show have been led by 2 colossal wicker and wood effigies, Gog and Magog. These figures, though often called giants, are depicted as ancient armored warriors, guardians of the city. Their presence is a direct link to Geoffrey of Monmouth's foundational myth, where the giant Gog-Magog was defeated by Brutus's companions. By adopting these figures, London wasn't just telling a story, it was writing itself into that story as the direct successor to that heroic, mythic past. The giants were no longer enemies, they were captured and converted into symbolic protectors, their immense strength now harnessed to defend the city they once threatened. This transformation is the essence of heraldic symbolism, taking a force of chaos and bending it to represent sanctioned power. We see this pattern in town crests across Britain. A community living near a large, mysterious hill or an ancient stone circle might incorporate a giant into its heraldry, not as a monster, but as a unique feature of their landscape, a claim to a distinctive and storied local identity. The giant becomes the genius loci, the spirit of the place, formally adopted by the people who live there. Even the wild man, a cousin to the giant knight covered in leaves and wielding a club, appears on countless European coats of arms, representing raw, natural strength and independence. These heraldic giants communicate specific virtues, immense physical power, of course, but also antiquity, resilience, and a deep, unbreakable connection to the land itself. They announce that the bearer's roots go deeper than written history, into the age of legends. By institutionalizing the giant in this way, the medieval and early modern world performed a final act of alchemy on the myth. The terrifying, unpredictable being from the hills was safely captured, stylized, and placed upon a shield, where its power could be controlled, displayed, and inherited. It became a badge of honor, a permanent reminder that the line between monster and guardian, between chaos and order, was often just a matter of who was telling the story and who got to paint it on their banner. Yet the heraldic giants, frozen on shields and banners, could not contain the story forever. As Europe moved into the Renaissance and the early modern period, the ink-stained world of writers and poets seized the myth, reshaping it for a new age of exploration and religious upheaval. The giant knight was no longer just a local ghost or a symbol on a crest. He became a walking, talking allegory, a vessel for the deepest anxieties and debates of the time. Perhaps the most magnificent example is found in the sprawling epic of Edmund Spenser, The Faerie Queene, published in the 1590s. Spenser populated his allegorical landscape with giants, but these were not the noble, if doomed, guardians of old. They were monstrous incarnations of sin and error. The most famous is the giant Orgoglio, whose name itself means pride. When the Knight of Holiness, the Red Cross Knight, is weakened by sin, Orgoglio easily defeats and imprisons him. This giant is not a physical challenge to be overcome with strength, but a spiritual one, representing the bloated, arrogant pride that swells when virtue falters. He is a moral lesson clad in monstrous flesh. Another, the giantess Argante, embodies unbridled lust. Spenser used these colossal figures to make abstract theological concepts terrifyingly tangible for his readers. The battle was no longer for a hill fort, but for the human soul. This shift was profound. The giant knight, and giants in general, became a standard literary shorthand for dangerous excess, whether it was rebellion against the crown, heresy against the church, or the tyranny of unchecked passion. They were the enemies of order, reason, and true faith, perfect villains for an era obsessed with defining all three. But while poets like Spenser wrote for the courtly elite, the myth thrived in a far more democratic medium, the cheap, crudely printed chapbooks sold at fairs and in market squares. These were the pulp fiction of their day, filled with sensational tales of giants like the famous Cormoran of St. Michael's Mount or the monstrous Blunderbore. The stories were simple, thrilling, and always ended with a clever human hero, often a figure named Jack, outwitting the brute. This kept the giant archetype vibrantly alive in the popular imagination, but it also simplified him. The chapbook giant was less a complex knight and more a straightforward obstacle, a personification of brute stupidity to be conquered by native wit and courage. This was the myth digesting itself for mass consumption, ensuring every child knew the pattern: giant appears, giant threatens, giant is tricked and falls. Yet even as these stories sold by the thousands, a new wind was beginning to blow, one that would challenge the very ground the giant stood on. The Enlightenment, with its fierce commitment to reason, evidence, and scientific inquiry, began to dismantle the world that made the literal giant knight believable. Scholars and antiquarians started to look at those oversized swords and long graves with a skeptical eye. They proposed new explanations: that the swords were ceremonial, the graves were for multiple burials or included space for grave goods. The giant was evicted from history and reassigned to literature. He became a metaphor, not a memory. This intellectual shift is perfectly captured in the changing tone of writing. By the 18th century, a mention of a giant knight in a text was often accompanied by a wry smile or dismissive footnote. He was now a charming superstition, a relic of a less enlightened age, useful for moral fables or satirical cartoons, but not to be taken seriously as a historical fact. The giant knight had completed his long journey, from a feared spirit of the land, to a symbol of royal authority, to a complex allegory for sin, and finally, to a device of pure fiction. This evolution mirrors the changing human worldview itself, from a world animated by spirits and miracles to one explained by laws and logic. The giant didn't vanish. He simply retreated into the pages of books and the realm of story, where his power to challenge, terrify, and teach remained undiminished. The Enlightenment may have banished the giant from serious history, but it could not erase him from the landscape or the human heart. A new kind of seeker arose in the 18th and 19th centuries, the antiquarian. These were gentlemen scholars, often clergymen or country squires, with a deep curiosity about the ancient past. Armed with notebooks, sketchpads, and a romantic sensibility, they set out to catalogue Britain's crumbling ruins and collect its fading stories. Figures like William Stukeley, best known for his early studies of Stonehenge, were fascinated by the old tales of giant knights. Riding out to lonely barrows or weathered hill forts, they would interview elderly locals, meticulously recording the legends of spectral guardians and buried titans. In doing so, these antiquarians performed an invaluable service. They preserved oral traditions that might otherwise have vanished into the silence of industrialization. Yet their approach was never neutral. They viewed these stories through a lens of romantic nationalism, seeing in the giant knight a noble, if primitive, ancestor, a symbol of a wild, poetic Britain that was rapidly disappearing. The tales were charming relics of a simpler time, to be collected and cherished like pressed flowers in a book. This act of collection, however, subtly changed the story's status. By writing them down as folklore, the antiquarians gently shifted them from being believed history to being appreciated heritage. The giant knight was becoming a character in a national storybook, not a being from a living past. Their curiosity was not satisfied with pen and paper alone. The same romantic impulse that drove them to collect stories also compelled them to seek physical proof. This led to some of the first, often crude, archaeological investigations of sites associated with the legends. A barrow known locally as the Giant's Grave was an irresistible target. With teams of hired laborers, an antiquarian would order a trench dug straight through the center of the mound, hoping to find the colossal bones of the guardian. What they typically uncovered were far more ordinary, yet to them mysterious, remains, fragments of Bronze Age pottery, flint tools, or a crouched skeleton buried with a simple beaker. Lacking modern archaeological methods, they often misinterpreted what they found. That crouched burial, its bones compacted by time, might be declared the skeleton of a dwarf or a child, its true age and culture completely misunderstood. The absence of a giant skeleton did not disprove the legend in their eyes. Instead, it might suggest the giant's remains had turned to dust, or that they had simply dug in the wrong spot. The tangible artifacts they did recover, like a rusted spearhead or a piece of ornamented metal, were sometimes hailed as the giant's weapon or a piece of his vast armor, their true scale and purpose exaggerated to fit the expected narrative. This period created a fascinating duality. On one hand, it systematically preserved the stories of giant knights for future generations, freezing them in published journals and county histories. On the other, it firmly placed them in the category of folklore, a word that itself gained its modern meaning during this time. The giant was no longer a potential threat or a historical reality. He was a picturesque feature of the countryside, a tale to be told beside the fireplace. This framing cemented the myth's place in popular culture, but it also sanitized it. The terrifying, awe-inspiring guardian of the margins was now a safe, even sentimental figure. He appeared in popular magazines, in poems by romantic writers, and in the guidebooks for early tourists seeking the picturesque. The antiquarian's hunt, for all its good intentions, had tamed the giant. It had exchanged the living, breathing fear and reverence of the medieval peasant for the collector's detached admiration. The knight's armor was now dusted off and displayed in a cabinet of curiosities, labeled not as a tool of war, but as a charming curiosity. This transformation raises a compelling question for our own time. If the giant knight is now firmly a creature of story, what power does he still hold over us? And where might we find his echo in the modern world? The giant knight, safely contained in the pages of folklore, was about to receive a spectacular resurrection. The 19th century, with its smoke-belching factories and relentless progress, developed a powerful nostalgia for a pre-industrial past. This cultural longing gave birth to the Gothic revival and the Romantic movement, which did not just remember the giant knights. They dressed them in glorious new armor and set them upon vast, stormy canvases. Artists, no longer bound by the need to illustrate historical fact, were free to unleash their imaginations on these legendary figures. In book illustrations and popular prints, the giant knight became a staple of visual storytelling. George Cruikshank, famed for his caricatures and book illustrations, depicted giants with a wonderful, exaggerated physicality. His giants were not just tall, they were mountains of muscle and wild hair, their expressions oscillating between brutish stupidity and melancholy grandeur. When illustrating tales like Jack the Giant Killer, Cruikshank gave these beings a tangible presence, making them feel both terrifying and oddly pitiable, creatures of a vanishing world. But it was in the realm of serious painting that the archetype found its most sublime expression. The Romantic artists, obsessed with the sublime power of nature and intense emotion, saw in the giant knight the perfect symbol. He became a figure of elemental force, often depicted not in battle, but in moments of brooding solitude. Imagine a painting where a colossal, armored form sits upon a cliff, gazing out over a tempestuous sea, his silhouette merging with the dark, jagged rocks. He is no longer a villain to be defeated, but a personification of the landscape itself, a manifestation of its ancient, untamable spirit. This visual treatment elevated the myth from a simple folk tale to a subject of high art, imbuing it with a new layer of poetic melancholy and awe. The giant was no longer a mere monster. He was a tragic remnant of a more heroic, if savage, age. This aesthetic recycling extended far beyond the canvas, shaping the very environment people lived in. The Gothic revival in architecture was a wholesale reimagining of the medieval world. Wealthy industrialists and aristocrats commissioned the construction of mock castles and abbeys, complete with fabricated ruins and crenellated towers. These structures, like Walter Scott's Abbotsford in Scotland or the fantastical Castell Coch in Wales, were designed to evoke the atmosphere of chivalric romance. They were stage sets for a dreamed-of past, and every such castle demanded a legend. It was almost inevitable that tales of giant guardians would be attached to these new old ruins, or that their exaggerated, grandiose scale would itself suggest the presence of giants. The architecture played into the lore, creating a physical, walk-through world where the idea of a giant knight felt perfectly at home. Strolling through a manicured garden to view a faux medieval keep, a Victorian gentleman could easily picture a titanic sentinel standing upon its battlements. This period effectively rebuilt the myth's habitat, ensuring it remained a living part of the cultural landscape. The Victorian medievalist imagination, fed by these paintings and buildings, consumed the giant knight through popular literature as well. The novels of Sir Walter Scott and the wildly influential poetry of Alfred, Lord Tennyson, especially his Idylls of the King, presented a polished, morally complex version of the Arthurian world. In this context, giant-like figures, such as the tragic Balin or the fierce Green Knight, were given psychological depth. They were not mindless obstacles, but characters wrestling with destiny, pride, and loss. This literary treatment cemented the giant knight's role as a symbolic figure within a national mythology. The Victorian era packaged the wild, local guardian of the hills into a complete aesthetic experience, one you could see in a gallery, read about in a leather-bound book, and visit on a weekend tour. This process made the myth safe for polite society, yet it also guaranteed its survival. By weaving the giant knight so thoroughly into their art, architecture, and literature, the 19th century bequeathed us the very image we still hold today, the romantic, tragic, and overwhelmingly visual icon of a towering warrior from a lost world. This aesthetic legacy is so powerful that it now shapes how we search for the truth behind the tale, leading us to a field of science that speaks in measurements and genetics, not in brushstrokes or stone. The romantic paintings and mock castles of the Victorian era preserved the giant knight as an aesthetic ideal, but the 20th and 21st centuries gave him a new, global stage. The archetype found its natural home in modern fantasy, where it has been reforged into some of our most iconic fictional beings. Consider J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, a world deeply rooted in the medieval myths of our own. Tolkien populated his epic with clear descendants of the giant knight. The Ents, the ancient shepherds of the trees, are guardians of immense size and antiquity, bound by a solemn duty to protect their forests. They are not warriors in plate armor, but their role as silent, patient sentinels of a fading world directly echoes the guardian knights of British hills. More explicitly, we see the archetype in creatures like the stone giants of the misty mountains, elemental forces that shape the landscape itself, and most powerfully in the Olog High, the armored trolls bred by Sauron in the later ages. These are not the stupid, cave-dwelling trolls of fairy tales. The Olog High are described as fierce and cunning, able to withstand sunlight, and they march to war clad in dark armor. They are, in essence, a dark mirror of the chivalric ideal, giant knights in the service of a malevolent power. Tolkien, a scholar of Old English and Norse legend, understood the template perfectly, and he used it to evoke a sense of ancient, overwhelming power, whether for good or for ill. This legacy flows directly into the blockbuster fantasies of our own time. The world of Game of Thrones presents giants not as monsters, but as a dying race from beyond the wall. They are immense, shaggy-haired beings who fight with crude weapons, yet they possess their own culture and loyalty. When Wun the giant storms the gates of Winterfell, it is a moment of pure, primal force crashing against the stone and steel of human politics. He is a relic of an older, wilder world, a living piece of myth thrust into a war for a kingdom that was never meant for him. His presence on the battlefield changes the scale of the conflict, reminding viewers and characters alike that there are powers in the world far older and more physically potent than the scheming of lords and ladies. In video games, the archetype becomes an interactive experience. The Soulsborne series, particularly Dark Souls, builds entire encounters around the idea of the giant knight. Players routinely face bosses who are towering, armor-clad entities, often guarding sacred places, bridges, or tombs. Defeating them is rarely a test of simple strength. It is a meticulous dance of patience, timing, and learning patterns, a direct, visceral engagement with the archetype as an obstacle that forges skill. These digital giants are the ultimate guardians, their very design meant to evoke awe and intimidation, making the player's eventual victory feel genuinely earned. So why does this specific figure, the giant in armor, remain so compelling across centuries and mediums? The answer lies in its narrative efficiency and deep symbolic resonance. In any story of epic struggle, you need a benchmark for scale, a way to show that the stakes and the adversaries are truly monumental. A giant knight does this instantly. His sheer size establishes a physical hierarchy, making the hero's courage and cunning seem all the more extraordinary. But beyond scale, he represents ancient power. He is a holdover from a mythic age, a piece of the world's deep past intruding upon the present. Whether he is a protector of forgotten truths or a weapon of a dark lord, his presence immediately deepens the history and texture of the fictional world. He makes the setting feel old, layered, and alive with forces beyond everyday understanding. Furthermore, the armor is crucial. It signifies order, discipline, and purpose. A wild giant is a force of nature, but a giant in armor is a force of will. He has been equipped, trained, or enchanted for a specific role, usually one of defense or conquest. This makes him a perfect antagonist or ally in stories about civilizations clashing, kingdoms rising and falling, and the eternal conflict between the wild and the ordered. The modern iterations, from Tolkien's trolls to the guardians of video game dungeons, prove that the giant knight is more than a medieval superstition. He is a fundamental piece of our storytelling vocabulary, a tool we use to explore themes of power, legacy, and the haunting presence of the ancient world within our own. And as we have dressed him in new digital armors and placed him on new screens, We have also begun to ask a more scientific question with the tools of our age. Could such a being have ever truly existed in our own non-fictional past? The armor and the legends point toward a body of extraordinary size. But what if that body was not mythical, but medical? Modern science offers a compelling human-scale key to this mystery, a condition known as gigantism. This is a rare disorder caused by a benign tumor on the pituitary gland, a small pea-sized organ at the base of the brain. When this happens in childhood or adolescence, before the growth plates in the bones have sealed, the tumor produces an excessive amount of growth hormone. The result is an acceleration of growth in nearly every tissue of the body, leading to an individual who achieves a height far beyond the normal range for their time and population. In adults, a similar overproduction is called acromegaly, which leads not to increased height, but to a thickening of the bones in the hands, feet, and face, resulting in a distinctive, enlarged appearance. For a medieval society with no understanding of endocrinology, a person with gigantism would have been a living wonder and likely a figure of profound fear and fascination. Their very physiology would have seemed like a sign from God or a mark of supernatural origin. But do we have any physical evidence that such individuals existed in the Middle Ages? The answer, etched in bone, is yes. Archaeological excavations across Europe have unearthed skeletal remains that tell a silent story of extraordinary growth. One of the most famous examples is the skeleton of an Irishman from the 13th century, discovered in a cemetery at Ballyshannon. Analysis showed he stood approximately 7 feet 3 inches tall, a staggering height for the era. His bones showed the classic markers of pituitary gigantism, including an enlarged sella turcica, the bony saddle in the skull that houses the pituitary gland. This was not a giant from a storybook. This was a real man whose body grew according to a different internal rhythm. Medieval medical texts, while not understanding the hormonal cause, did note such conditions. Physicians might describe a patient as having excessive humors, leading to monstrous size, or record cases of individuals who grew continuously throughout their lives. These scattered references, combined with the physical evidence from graves, confirm that people of immense stature were a rare but real part of the medieval world. Now place such an individual into the context of nobility. If a son of a lord or a wealthy landowning family developed gigantism, his destiny would almost certainly have been shaped by his physical gift. He would have been raised and trained as a knight, for his potential on the battlefield would have been too valuable to ignore. Imagine the sight of him during training. His reach would be incredible, his strength formidable. A sword built to his proportions would be a devastating weapon, and his very presence would break enemy formations through sheer intimidation. On the tournament field or in actual combat, a knight of 7 feet or more, clad in custom-fitted armor atop a massive destrier, would have been a terrifying and awe-inspiring spectacle. He would not have been just another soldier. He would have been a living banner, a focal point of both hope and dread. In the chaos of battle, where perception is everything, it is easy to see how the stories would begin. A soldier witnessing this colossus cut through the ranks would not later tell his children about the Lord's son with a medical condition. He would speak of the giant who fought for the king, whose sword strokes felled 3 men at once, whose armor gleamed like a small fortress. Over generations and across the distance of storytelling, the precise details of the man would melt away, leaving only the amplified essence, the giant knight. This medical hypothesis does not diminish the myth. It grounds it in a poignant reality. It suggests that at the heart of some of these legends may lie the memory of real individuals who lived extraordinary lives within the rigid structures of their time, men whose very bodies destined them to become legends. Their biological reality became the seed, and the human need for wonder did the rest, cultivating a story that grew far taller than the man himself ever could. The skeleton of the Ballyshannon man provides a crucial clue. But to understand how exceptional he truly was, we need to know the world he stood so far above. The average height of a medieval European man was strikingly short by modern standards, hovering around 5 feet 7 inches, with significant variation based on nutrition, class, and region. In a world of frequent famine, hard labor, and limited medical knowledge, bodies simply did not reach the potential we see today. A man standing even 6 feet tall would have been notably imposing, a head and shoulders above the crowd. This context makes the discovery of any skeleton approaching or exceeding 7 feet not just interesting, but statistically extraordinary. These were the 1 in 1,000, the physical anomalies that defied the harsh realities of their time. Beyond Ireland, Europe offers other tantalizing cases. The so-called Giant of Lucerne is a famous, if complex, example. Historical accounts from the 16th century describe the exhumation of a massive skeleton purported to be over 19 feet tall, which was later displayed as a curiosity. Modern analysis suggests this was likely a composite skeleton assembled from the bones of a mammoth or other large animals, a common practice in an era before comparative anatomy. While not a real human giant, the story itself is revealing. It shows an intense cultural desire to find and possess physical proof of the legendary past, even if it had to be manufactured. More credible are the carefully documented archaeological finds. In Poland, the skeleton of a medieval man measuring around 7 feet 2 inches was uncovered, his bones showing signs of the same pituitary issues. In Italy, a Lombard warrior from the 6th century was found buried with his weapons, his frame suggesting a height well over 6.5 feet. These were real people, not myths. But what of Britain itself, the very heart of the Albion legends? The record is more fragmentary, largely due to the acidic soils that plague much of the country, which eagerly consume bone and wood over centuries. Preservation is a lottery, and the bones of the exceptionally large are just as vulnerable as those of the average. However, occasional outliers do emerge from the earth. A Saxon burial from the 7th century in Kent revealed a man estimated at 6 feet 4 inches, a giant in his age. Another, from a medieval hospital cemetery in Scotland, showed skeletal markers consistent with acromegaly. These individuals were not buried in special giant tombs. They were laid to rest in ordinary cemeteries, their extraordinary stature known only to the community that buried them. The physical reality gleaned from these bones tells a story far removed from chivalric glory. Gigantism and acromegaly are debilitating conditions. The rapid, unregulated growth puts immense strain on the heart and circulatory system. Joint pain is severe and constant as the skeletal structure struggles to support its own mass. Vision problems and chronic headaches from the pituitary tumor would have been a daily burden. The life of a medieval person with this condition, even a noble one, would have been marked by pain and fatigue, a stark contrast to the image of the invincible, striding guardian. Their great strength may have been real, but it likely came at the cost of brittle bones and a shortened lifespan. This scientific perspective completes a poignant circle. It suggests that the towering knights of legend may have their origin in the rare, awe-inspiring, yet deeply human figures who walked among their shorter peers. They were not supernatural beings, but men whose bodies wrote a different story, one that their culture, lacking any other explanation, could only interpret as mythic. Their very presence became a catalyst for the stories we have traced from hill forts to heraldry. But if the giant was, in essence, a man, then the true magic lies not in his bones, but in what society chose to see in them. This leads us to the final, enduring power of the myth, the reason it was crafted, believed, and passed down through the centuries. So the question becomes not just whether giants existed, but what the word even meant to the people who used it. In a medieval village, where the average man stood perhaps 5 feet 6 inches, a stranger arriving at 6 feet 2 would have been a staggering sight. He would have towered over the blacksmith, loomed above the priest, his head brushing the lintels of doorways built for shorter frames. In that context, he was not just tall, he was a giant. The term was relative, a description of profound difference rather than a measurement in feet and inches. This relativity is the key to unlocking the chronicles' accounts. When a monk wrote that a knight was a giant, he was often employing a powerful literary device, hyperbole, to convey awe and significance. He was telling his readers, this man was not like other men. His presence altered the very scale of the world around him. We see this same pattern in medieval travel writings, where explorers encountering new cultures would frequently describe the inhabitants as giants. The Norse sagas, for instance, often labeled the indigenous peoples of North America as scralings of great size, a perception born from difference, unfamiliarity, and perhaps a dash of fear. The word giant served as a shorthand for the utterly foreign and formidable. Linguistically, this evolution is fascinating. Old English words like ent or thyers for a giant carried connotations of ancientness and monstrousness, but also of sheer size. Over time, as languages blended and concepts shifted, the word giant itself, from the Latin gigas, solidified around the idea of immense physical stature. But its usage remained wonderfully flexible. A giant in a moral allegory might represent the sin of pride, swollen to monstrous proportions. A giant in a local legend might be a landowner of unusual height and cruel disposition, his physical and social stature merging in the minds of the oppressed. This fluidity allowed the story to breathe and grow. The process is a classic engine of folklore, the telephone game played across centuries. It begins with a kernel of truth, a knight of notable height and strength, perhaps the Lord's champion. In his lifetime, tales of his deeds spread, each telling adding a little more to his stature. After his death, the stories consolidate. The knight who was very tall becomes the knight who was impossibly tall. His custom-made armor, stored in the castle hall, is pointed to as proof. The long ceremonial sword used in processions is remembered as his personal weapon. A generation later, the story has crystallized. He is no longer Sir William, the exceptionally tall knight who defended the bridge. He is the giant knight of the old bridge, a spectral figure who appears on foggy nights, his footsteps shaking the very stones. The man has been completely absorbed by the myth. His real height is irrelevant. What matters is the symbolic height he achieved in memory. This transformative process did not require malice or deceit. It is simply how human communities remember and make sense of the extraordinary. The exceptional individual becomes a landmark in the story of the place itself. So when we read a chronicle that speaks of a giant knight, we are not necessarily reading a description. We are reading the culmination of this folkloric process, the endpoint of a story that has been polished by countless retellings, each one adding another inch to his legend, until he stands forever as a colossus in the imagination of a people. The transformation from man to myth was rarely accidental, and often served a purpose far beyond the fireside. In the hands of a shrewd ruler, the legend of the giant knight could be sharpened into a tool of statecraft, a form of psychological warfare long before the term existed. Kings and lords understood that a nation's spirit is shaped by its stories, and a story of invincible ancestral giants defending the realm was potent political currency. It created an aura of divine favor and unassailable heritage, suggesting that the current monarch's authority was not just a matter of lineage, but a continuation of a heroic, almost superhuman destiny. This was defensive propaganda, a shield of narrative meant to intimidate external rivals and unify the populace under a banner of legendary strength. Consider the reign of Edward I, a monarch known to history as Longshanks for his own imposing height. Standing well over 6 feet in an age of shorter stature, Edward was a living example of the giant archetype. He actively cultivated an image of formidable chivalric power, and his military campaigns, particularly against Wales and Scotland, were framed as a righteous reclamation of Arthurian Britain. By invoking the legends of ancient British heroes and the giants they defeated, Edward was not merely recalling folklore, he was positioning himself as their direct successor, the latest in a line of colossal figures ordained to unite the island. His famous Round Table feast at Neffin and his alleged attempt to relocate the supposed bones of the giant Gog-Magog to Westminster were calculated acts of myth-making. They sent a clear message to his subjects and his enemies. The King of England was the inheritor of a legacy so mighty it bordered on the supernatural. The psychological impact on the battlefield is not hard to imagine. Edward's own troops, marching behind a king whose very physique echoed the old tales, could feel they were part of a destined heroic enterprise. Conversely, a Scottish clansman hearing rumours of the English king's giant-like stature and his claim to Arthur's mantle might feel a tremor of doubt, as if he were opposing not just an army, but the weight of myth itself. This utility extended brilliantly into the Tudor era, a dynasty desperate to cement its legitimacy after the bloody Wars of the Roses. The Tudors, especially Henry VII and his son Henry VIII, masterfully co-opted Arthurian legend, tracing their Welsh ancestry back to the ancient kings of Britain. They revived the myth of Albion, presenting England as a new Camelot awaiting its rightful ruler. In this carefully constructed narrative, the giant knights of lore were subtly reframed. They were no longer just wild guardians of the hills, but symbolic precursors to Tudor strength, ancient powers that had been tamed and harnessed by a line of kings now culminating in the Tudors themselves. The extravagant pageantry of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, where Henry VIII sought to outshine the King of France, was a spectacle of giant proportions, literally and figuratively. Henry's custom-made armor, engineered to make him appear even more massively broad-shouldered and powerful, was a direct visual claim to this mythic stature. He was fashioning himself into a modern giant knight, a defender of the faith in the realm, whose very appearance was meant to deter challengers and command awe. This strategic use of the myth reveals its core function as ideological architecture. For a state, without modern mass media, folklore and symbolism were the primary channels for broadcasting power. A story about a giant knight guarding a border region did more than entertain. It implanted the idea that the land itself, through its ancient protectors, sanctioned the current ruler's claim. It turned geography into genealogy and legend into law. The giant knight, therefore, stands at the intersection of memory and manipulation. He was a folkloric figure that could be polished and placed into the service of the crown, a reminder that the stories we tell about our past are never neutral. They are often weapons, worn smooth by time, but wielded with precise intention to defend a throne, unite a people, or justify a conquest. The armor of the giant, in the end, may have been worn not by a man of abnormal height, but by the state itself. The stones themselves seem to whisper of impossible residence. Walk through the arched entrance of Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, and you pass beneath a doorway of such generous height and width it feels built for a different order of being. In the great halls of other medieval fortresses, fireplaces yawn wide enough to park a small car, and staircases ascend with steps spaced for a much longer stride. These architectural anomalies are the most persuasive, silent witnesses in the case for the giant knights, physical proof etched in timber and stone that seems to defy any ordinary explanation. The logic appears straightforward. A giant door must have been built for a giant to walk through. Yet the truth behind these oversized features is a story not of biology, but of ceremony, technology, and sheer human pride. Take those monumental doorways. Their primary function was often processional, not personal. A castle was not just a home, it was a stage for power. On great occasions, the Lord needed to make an entrance, and that entrance often involved more than just himself. He might be on horseback, requiring clearance for a rider in a plumed helm. He might be preceded by standard bearers, holding aloft banners on long poles, or followed by a retinue of armored knights. The doorway had to accommodate this flowing spectacle of authority, allowing the entire impressive retinue to pass into the courtyard without a single banner dipping or a helmet scraping the lintel. It was about creating an unobstructed funnel for pageantry, a grand threshold that announced your importance to every visitor. Then there are those cavernous fireplaces. The practical demands of heating a vast, drafty stone hall were immense. A large fireplace with a wide opening and a deep hearth was essential for managing the enormous logs needed to throw heat across the room. But it also served a crucial ventilation purpose, acting as a giant exhaust flue to draw smoke up and out, preventing the hall from filling with a choking haze. The sheer scale was a display of wealth, proving the Lord could afford the vast quantities of firewood required to fill such a space. It was domestic engineering inflated to the level of statement. Even the spacing of steps in some spiral staircases, which can feel awkward for a modern person, often had a defensive rationale. The irregular rise, or tread, could be designed to disadvantage a right-handed attacker climbing upwards, while giving the right-handed defender above a better position to strike. What feels like a stride for a giant might simply be the uneven rhythm of medieval defensive architecture. So when a later generation, perhaps touring the ruins of a castle like Stokesay, saw these oversized elements, they connected them to the only framework they knew, the stories. That huge door wasn't for a knight on horseback with a banner, it was for the giant knight himself. That fireplace wasn't for heating a hall, it was where the giant cooked his meals. The architecture, divorced from its original living context, became a skeleton waiting for the myth to clothe it in flesh. This process of misattribution is a powerful reminder that our ancestors were not naive. They were simply interpreting the physical evidence with a different set of tools, the tools of story and legend. The stones were silent, so the stories spoke for them, dressing functional design in the magnificent armor of fairy tale. And if the castles themselves could not house these beings, perhaps the answer lies not in their halls, but in the very earth they were built upon, in the silent, subterranean world of caves and tunnels that hide a different kind of giant's lair. The oversized doorways of medieval castles are not the only stones that speak of giants. To truly understand the British giant knight, we must step back and see him not as a solitary figure, but as one face in a vast, global gallery of colossal beings. From the frozen north to the sun-baked plains of India, cultures separated by oceans and millennia have told strikingly similar stories. The Norse spoke of the Jotun, immense elemental beings of frost and fire who existed before the gods. They were chaos given form, constantly clashing with the Aesir, the gods of order who built the world from the body of a slain giant. In Hindu tradition, the Daityas are powerful demonic giants, often depicted as adversaries of the Devas, the gods. They represent a primal, anti-divine force, a challenge to cosmic balance that must be continually subdued. The Hebrew Bible mentions the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, the heroes of renown, born from the union of the sons of God and human women. They are presented as a race of giants whose existence precedes the Great Flood, a corrupting remnant of a lost age that needed to be cleansed. And of course, the Greeks told of the Titans, the primordial deities of incredible power, who ruled the cosmos before being overthrown and imprisoned by the Olympian gods, their younger, more civilized successors. In every single one of these traditions, a profound pattern repeats. These gigantic beings are almost always associated with the primal past, with the raw, untamed state of the world before the establishment of the current order. They are forces of chaos, wilderness, and immense, often terrifying, potential. Their stories are not merely about size, they are about transition. They narrate the foundational myth of how the world we know, ordered, structured, and governed by laws, came to be. The gods, the heroes, the knights, they represent this newer, organizing principle. The cosmic struggle is always the same, the triumph of culture over nature, of law over chaos, of the known over the unknown. The British giant knight fits perfectly into this ancient template. He is not an original invention, but a local adaptation. The wild god of the hill, the primal guardian of the spring, is Britain's Jotun, its Daitya. The knight who defeats him, or more tellingly, the knight he slowly becomes, is the local agent of that newer order, the Christian chivalric world, imposing its structure on the ancient landscape. The armor he wears is the symbol of that civilization, literally encasing the wild force in the rigid metal of human codes and hierarchies. This comparative view reveals something beautiful and fundamental about human psychology. It seems we are hardwired to explain our origins through a story of struggle against overwhelming colossal forces. Perhaps it is a metaphor for humanity's own journey, for our ancestors confronting a vast, dangerous, and incomprehensible natural world. The giant embodies every fear, every earthquake, every towering storm, every predator in the dark. Overcoming the giant, whether through divine power, heroic cunning, or enchanted swords, is the story of our survival and our ascent. It is how we tell ourselves that we belong here, that we have earned our place. The British giant knight, then, is not a quirky local legend. He is Albion's specific verse in a hymn sung by all of humanity, a chapter in the universal story of how we built our world from the bones of the old one. This shared mythology suggests the figure taps into something deep within us, a collective memory or a psychological archetype that transcends any single culture. And if that is true, then perhaps the final, most intriguing question is not about the past, but about our present. Why does this archetype, in its specific knightly form, still hold such power over our imagination today, centuries after we stopped believing in literal giants guarding our hills? The giants had retreated into the whispers of the land, but a new generation of listeners arrived just in time. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, with the industrial world's hum growing ever louder, a quiet but urgent movement began. It was a rescue mission for the vanishing past, led by scholars and enthusiasts we now call folklorists. These were not the romantic antiquarians of a century before, who collected stories as picturesque curiosities. These were methodical recorders, driven by scholarly conviction that the oral traditions of rural Britain were a fragile, irreplaceable part of the national heritage, and they were disappearing with every old farmer or village storyteller who passed away. Figures like Catherine Mary Briggs, who would later become a towering scholar of British folklore, began her life's work in this period, traveling to remote villages and patiently interviewing those who still held the old tales in memory. The goal was no longer to interpret or judge, but to preserve, to capture the voice of the tradition exactly as it was told. This was the birth of folklore as a serious academic discipline, and its timing was providential. The giant knights, those local guardians of hill and stream, were among the most prized finds in this salvage operation. Systematic projects like the County Folklore series, published by the Folklore Society, aimed to create a permanent, written archive for each region of Britain. Volunteer collectors, often local vicars, teachers, or doctors, would submit transcripts of stories they had gathered from the oldest inhabitants of their parishes. The methodology was straightforward but painstaking. It relied on trust, patience, and a good ear. A collector would visit an elderly informant, perhaps by a fireside or in a garden, and gently encourage them to share the stories they heard from their own grandparents. The challenge was immense. Memories were fallible, details changed with each telling, and some storytellers, sensing the collector's interest, might embellish a tale to make it more impressive. The very act of writing it down froze a fluid oral performance into a static text, losing the rhythm, the pauses, the local dialect, and the teller's personal flair. Yet, without this work, these stories would have vanished into silence. One collected tale, recorded in the early 1900s for the folklore of Herefordshire, offers a perfect glimpse. It tells of a place called Giant's Stone, a large glacial erratic in a farmer's field. The story recounted how, centuries ago, a knight of impossible size was buried there after falling in a great battle. The farmer who owned the land, the informant said, refused to ever move the stone, fearing it would disturb the giant's sleep and bring a curse upon his family. The collector noted the teller's absolute sincerity and the very specific, matter-of-fact detail about the farmer's superstition, a detail that gave the legend a living, practical consequence in the community. This was not a grand Arthurian romance. It was a local story rooted in a specific rock and a specific family's caution, exactly the kind of hyper-local lore that was evaporating fastest. These collected volumes became treasure troves. Within their pages, the giant knight appeared again and again, but always in his local uniform. In Cornwall, he was often a coastal sentinel linked to shipwrecks and pirates. In the Scottish borders, he was a reaver of monstrous proportions. In the Midlands, he was a ghostly guardian of ancient trackways. The folklorists saved these variations from oblivion, providing the raw, unpolished data for all future analysis. Their work reminds us that the myth was never a single, monolithic story, but a chorus of local voices, each singing of the giant who watched over their particular patch of England's green and dreaming land. This preserved chorus allows us to hear the final, haunting notes of the tradition, just before the modern world turned up the volume on a different song entirely. The folklorists preserved the stories, but the 20th century gave them a startling new wardrobe. In our modern age, the giant knight has been drafted into a different kind of myth, one clad not in plate armor, but in the speculative trappings of ancient astronauts and lost continents. For proponents of alternative history, the traditional explanations feel insufficient. A medical condition or a tall warrior seems too ordinary, too human for such an extraordinary legend. They reach for grander, more sensational answers. One popular theory reimagines these colossal figures as the last remnants of a pre-human race, survivors from a forgotten epoch like Atlantis or Lemuria. In this view, the giant knights were not myths at all, but the lingering memory of a technologically advanced civilization that was wiped out by a great cataclysm. Their immense size is explained as an evolutionary adaptation from a time when the Earth's atmosphere was different, or as the result of genetic knowledge we have since lost. The oversized armor and weapons found in museums are pointed to not as ceremonial objects, but as literal artifacts of this lost race. Proof that giants once walked among us and built the mysterious megalithic sites that dot the landscape. Another, even more cosmic interpretation removes the giants entirely from Earth's history. Here, the giant knights become ancient astronauts, extraterrestrial visitors who came to our planet in the distant past. Their towering stature and advanced armor are seen as descriptions of powered exoskeletons or biomechanical suits, misinterpreted by primitive humans who could only understand them through the lens of their own technology, swords and plate metal. The knights' role as guardians of sacred sites is reinterpreted as aliens monitoring their own ancient outposts or energy portals. In this framework, every local legend of a spectral knight on a hill becomes a fragmented report of an extraterrestrial presence, a piece of paleo-contact that has been buried under centuries of folklore. A third variation suggests these beings were not from other stars, but from other dimensions, occasionally crossing into our reality and appearing as monstrous, oversized figures to medieval observers. The appeal of all these theories is powerful and understandable. They offer a single, elegant, and thrilling solution to a bundle of complex mysteries. They connect the dots between giant lore, unexplained archaeology, and humanity's deep-seated sense that we are not the first masters of this world. Instead of wrestling with the messy, gradual processes of folklore transmission, medical conditions, and political propaganda, they present a clean, dramatic narrative. A hidden history far more exciting than the slow grind of academic research. They transform the giant knight from a symbol into a secret, a piece of forbidden knowledge waiting to be uncovered. It is a compelling story, but we must gently place it alongside the historical record. Established scholarship approaches the myth from the opposite direction. It builds understanding from the ground up, piece by piece. It starts with the physical evidence, the bones that show gigantism, the armor that fits a tall man, not a titan. It examines the social context, how stories were used for political power and community identity. It traces the literary evolution from Geoffrey of Monmouth to Spenser to Tennyson. This method does not yield a single, spectacular revelation. It constructs a mosaic, a nuanced picture where the giant knight is the product of many intersecting factors: biology, psychology, art, and politics. The alternative theories, while captivating, often have to dismiss or overlook this accumulated evidence to maintain their core premise. They must explain away the medical explanations for oversized skeletons, reinterpret functional architecture as proof of giant inhabitants, and treat metaphorical medieval literature as coded reportage. This is not to say these modern interpretations have no value. Far from it. Their greatest contribution is in the energy and public fascination they generate. By asking bold, unconventional questions, they keep the mystery of the giant knight alive in the popular imagination. They force mainstream historians to communicate their findings more clearly and to engage with the public's hunger for wonder. The debate itself, between the slow, careful work of academia and the sweeping visions of alternative history, ensures that the giant knight remains a subject of discussion, a figure that continues to challenge us to look at our past and ask, what is true, and what is truer than truth? The knight stands at the center of this modern clash, his silhouette now cast not just by firelight, but by the glow of television screens and internet forums, a timeless enigma refracted through the lens of our own technological age. A suit of armor stands empty in a field, but it is waiting for a giant. Across Britain and beyond, on weekends and at festivals, the legend of the colossal guardian does not merely survive in books. It walks, breathes, and clashes steel on steel. This is the realm of historical reenactment and living history, where the myth is physically resurrected by modern enthusiasts who step into the shoes and the oversized greaves of these towering figures. For a reenactor choosing to portray a giant knight, the commitment is immense, beginning with the most fundamental challenge, the armor itself. Off-the-rack harnesses from historical suppliers are built for average frames, so everything must be custom-made. This involves meticulous research, working with a skilled armorer to scale up historical designs while maintaining plausibility. The weight distribution becomes a critical engineering puzzle, as a suit for a 6'6" individual can easily double the weight of a standard kit, demanding extraordinary physical strength and endurance from the wearer. The helmet alone, with its enlarged visor and reinforced neck protection, becomes a world of its own, altering balance and perception. Every piece, from the gauntlets to the sabatons, is a testament to both historical craftsmanship and modern problem-solving, a dialogue between the imagined past and the tangible present. The challenges extend far beyond the forge. On the battlefield, a reenactor portraying a giant knight must develop a completely specialized approach to combat. The reach advantage is tremendous, but so is the inertia. A swing with a proportionally larger sword or poleaxe cannot be stopped or redirected quickly. It is a committed, sweeping motion. Footwork must be adapted to manage the greater weight and higher center of gravity. Fighting becomes less about rapid exchanges and more about controlling space, using that immense reach to keep multiple opponents at bay, much like the historical accounts describe. This physical experience offers a profound insight. It reveals that the legendary strength of the giant knight would have been as much a burden as a gift, a lesson in physics that no written chronicle can fully convey. Reenactors speak of the exhaustion, the heat, and the sheer concentration required, a visceral understanding that tempers the romantic myth with the gritty reality of human limits, even pushed to their extreme. Why would someone dedicate such effort to embodying a figure that likely never existed in this literal form? Conversations with members of societies like the Company of the Giant, a conceptual group representing such interests, reveal deep and personal motivations. For some, it is about representation, giving a physical form to a story that captivated them since childhood. They are not pretending to be a real historical giant, but are giving body to a cultural archetype, making the folklore walk among us. For others, it is about exploring the margins of history, portraying the exceptional individual, the champion whose unusual stature would have marked him as a focal point on any medieval battlefield. It is an exercise in historical empathy, asking what it might have felt like to be that person, to move through a world built for smaller people, to be the subject of awe and perhaps fear. There is also a powerful element of spectacle and education. A giant knight in a living history camp is an irresistible draw for the public, a walking question mark that prompts immediate curiosity and opens the door to deeper conversations about medieval life, warfare, and how myths are born from the seeds of rare reality. This embodiment reaches its most dramatic pitch at modern jousting tournaments. While knights today are of all sizes, a particularly tall and powerfully built rider in full plate, mounted on a massive draft horse bred to carry the weight, creates an undeniable echo of the legend. The thunder of the hooves, the shuddering impact of the lance, the sheer visual scale of the combatant all conspire to momentarily blur the line between reenactment and archetype. The crowd's reaction is telling, a collective gasp or murmur that is different from the applause for other riders. It is a spark of primal recognition, a flicker of the old wonder. In that moment, the modern hobbyist becomes a channel for a centuries-old story, proving that the power of the giant knight lies not in his historical reality, but in his enduring capacity to inspire awe. He is a myth that we have chosen to keep alive, not just in our minds, but with our hands, our tools, and our own physical strength, forging a new link in a very old chain. The armor may be empty, but the story it tells is full to bursting. So why does this particular legend, of all the medieval mysteries, cling so stubbornly to our imagination? Its endurance is no accident. It survives because it sits at a perfect, powerful intersection of human needs, a story woven from threads of history, psychology, and pure narrative magic. First, it is anchored in a tangible, familiar reality. We know knights existed. We can visit their castles, see their swords, and read their chronicles. The giant knight takes this bedrock of real history and stretches it into the realm of the extraordinary, making the impossible feel just a few steps beyond the possible. It explains the unexplained in a world before science. That strange, oversized helmet in the Lord's Hall, that long, empty stone coffin in the field, the massive thigh bone dug up by a farmer. For centuries, the giant knight was the most satisfying answer available. He gave a name and a purpose to the oddities that littered the landscape, transforming random artifacts into pieces of a grand, heroic puzzle. More deeply, the myth fulfills a profound psychological need. In a dangerous and unpredictable world, the idea of a superhuman protector is a profound comfort. The giant knight is the ultimate guardian, a being whose very size promises security. He externalizes our fears and gives them a form that can, in stories at least, be outwitted, bargained with, or even befriended. He also feeds our need for wonder. Life can feel small and routine, but the notion that the hills themselves might be watched over by ancient armored sentinels introduces a thrilling scale of mystery into the everyday. It suggests that just beyond the edge of the village, the world is still old and strange and charged with hidden meanings. This taps into a universal longing for a landscape that is alive with story, not just geography. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it is simply a terrific story. The giant knight is a gift to any storyteller. He is a ready-made symbol of overwhelming challenge, a walking obstacle that forces heroes to rely on cunning over brute strength. He embodies timeless conflicts, the wild versus the civilized, chaos versus order, the ancient past versus the emerging present. He can be a terrifying villain, a tragic figure, or a noble ally, his role shifting to fit the moral of the tale. This narrative flexibility has allowed him to evolve effortlessly from oral folk tale to allegorical poem, to fantasy novel, to pixelated video game boss. He is a character template that never wears out. In the end, then, the giant knight of Albion is less a historical fact waiting to be proven, and far more a cultural mirror. For over 1,000 years, this figure has reflected back the changing face of Britain itself. To the early medieval mind, he was a wild spirit of the land, a remnant of a pagan world slowly being baptized. To the Norman chronicler, he was a political tool, a symbol of a conquered landscape and a legitimized new order. To the Tudor court, he was a piece of theatrical propaganda, proof of a dynasty's mythic roots. To the Romantic artist, he became a melancholy symbol of sublime nature, a poetic relic of a lost heroic age. And to us today, he is a versatile icon of fantasy, a vessel for our own modern explorations of power, identity, and the allure of the ancient. We have searched for him in crumbling parchments and oversized graves, in medical conditions and heraldic symbols. We have dressed him in the armor of our own eras, from Spenser's allegory to Tolkien's epic to the digital arenas of our screens. Each time we retell his story, we are not digging up a buried truth. We are having a conversation with our own past. The legend persists because it is not about finding a giant. It is about understanding why we needed to invent one in the first place. He stands at the border of our collective memory, a silent sentinel guarding not a hill fort or a tomb, but the very human desire for a past that is larger than life, a landscape that is alive with guardians, and a story that makes us look at the old, familiar world and wonder what secrets it still holds. That empty suit of armor in the field, then, is not waiting for a giant to fill it, but for us to understand the story it represents. Our journey has taken us from the primordial hills shaped by Celtic gods to the candlelit scriptoriums of Geoffrey of Monmouth, from the symbolic shields of medieval barons to the digital battlefields of modern fantasy. We have followed the clues left in oversized bones, in ceremonial swords, and in the very stones of castles built for pageantry, not for titans. The most compelling truth we have uncovered is not a single, spectacular revelation, but a tapestry woven from many threads. At its heart, we find the rare individual, the man whose body was shaped by gigantism, whose extraordinary stature in a world of shorter people made him a living legend. Around him, we see the natural exaggeration of storytelling, where a tall and powerful warrior becomes, over generations, a figure of impossible size. We have examined the physical artifacts, the long graves and great swords that were misinterpreted by later ages as proof of these beings, and we have traced how this potent image was harnessed as political symbolism, a tool to legitimize kings and unify a nation under the banner of a heroic, colossal past. The truth, in the end, is more fascinating than any simple fiction. It is the story of how human communities explain the unexplainable, how we seek comfort in tales of protectors, and how we use narrative to build identity and claim our place in the world. The giant knight is a magnificent cultural invention, a mirror held up to 1,000 years of British history, reflecting its fears, its ambitions, and its longing for a past that was larger than life. So where does this leave our quest? The mystery remains alive, not as a historical puzzle to be solved, but as an invitation. Visit the local sites where these stories cling to the landscape, whether it is a lone barrow called the Giant's Grave or a castle with a doorway that makes you wonder. Read the chronicles for yourself and feel the awe in the monk's exaggerated prose. Most importantly, listen for the echoes in your own area. Does your town have a tale of a colossal guardian, a spectral sentinel, or a strangely shaped hill with a legendary past? Share those stories in the comments below. By exchanging these fragments of folklore, we become part of the tradition itself, keeping the conversation and the wonder alive for the next generation.